All right. Well, Ross, welcome to In Search of Wisdom.
Thank you, Joshua, for having me. It's a pleasure.
It is a pleasure on this end. As I was just stating before we hit record, really enjoyed the book and so happy that I found it. And that book for the listeners that we're going to be talking about today is Christian Philosophy as a Way of Life. But like most episodes, before we get into it, I want to spend a few minutes and get to know a little bit about you and your own search. So, would you mind sharing maybe how you initially found your way to have an interest in philosophy?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for me, I didn't have an intellectual bone in my body in high up to high school. I'd say up to my junior year in high school. All the assigned books we were supposed to read, all the classics for high school, I would get the cliff notes and skim them, right? I had zero intellectual appetite for truth or for wisdom or understanding, who we are and our place in the universe. And it wasn't until actually coming to Christ, as becoming a Christian, when I was 16 years old, that it was almost as if kind of there was this soul renovation that happened in me, and it was like there were some additional add-ons to my soul that I didn't really even know what these were. And one of those was just an intellectual curiosity to for knowledge and wisdom and truth, and just wasn't truth interested up to that point. And something shifted within me when I was 16 years old, and I think it became that was the start of a kind of a journey or a quest for me to just greater deepening my understanding of reality and the good life. And it's really been a journey ever since, honestly. But that's at least what jump started the initial interest in philosophical study. Actually, I should say how it got narrowed to philosophy in particular. I remember studying all sorts of things in college. I was a biblical studies major. And I remember it was just the questions that I was gravitating towards, Joshua, the ones that were keeping me up at night. They were those deeper fundamental questions, the bigger questions, the weightier questions than I realized my peers and my professors were really asking at that point in my life. And so I walked into my first philosophy class at this college that I transferred into. And I walked into this class, I looked at the syllabus, and it was almost like there was this existential homecoming in a sense where I realized these are the questions. Like, there's a discipline that I can devote myself to, and there's been a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years about these big questions. And that really kind of got me leaning in initially to start listening to the historical conversation. So that was kind of how it started for me to get interested in the history of philosophy, trying to bring myself up to speed as to what's the conversation been about reality and the good life and knowledge and so forth. So I'd say that's really how things got jump started for me. It was my kind of uh, entering into a religious community at that point that really began to um, instill and cultivate in me desire for truth and wisdom and understanding the world.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ross. It's so interesting that you know the kind of general time frame of when
Yeah.
it initially started, which is fairly common, across the guests that we've had. There's some
Huh.
sort of moment that kicks off. I call it a search, but you could call it many. The title of the book, Christian Philosophy,
Yeah.
we don't, especially like as lay people, myself, don't always think of those two things
Mhm.
put together. Like why is that, you think?
Why is it that we don't often sort of wed together Christianity and philosophy?
Yes.
Yeah, that's I think, a really important question, a really multifaceted question. Maybe one pass at it would be something like many people think about Christianity um, not as a kind of systematic philosophy of life or systematic set of truths about reality and the good life. They think of it more in um, maybe subjective terms as maybe something that can help my life go well, and that's really all. They don't think of it necessarily in terms of a system that has certain entailments regarding reality and how reality is structured and what's fundamental and what sorts of goods are ultimately worth pursuing, and say like a philosophy of life that would stand toe to toe to other uh, ancient philosophies, say like Epicureanism or Stoicism or things like that, or Platonism or Neoplatonism. I just We don't tend to think about Christianity in those kind of fully orbed terms. We think of it more maybe in the psychological sense, as maybe therapeutic in the thin sense of the word. That is, it just sort of helps. It's something that I can sort of draw on that will help my life go better subjectively. Um, Maybe that's one reason why we don't tend to think about Christianity as like offering knowledge of reality in the good life. We tend to rely upon it as uh, a guide for living only, right? Rather than a guide for living that's based in knowledge of reality and the good life. So that may be one reason that a lot of Christians are very praxis oriented. They're very action oriented, and I, you know, and the sort of the intellectual substance of Christianity can often get eclipsed in that kind of value structure, where we're focusing solely on just tell me what I need to do, right? Tell me how I need to live.
Yeah.
That's an important question, but
Yeah.
that's not the that's a downstream question, I think, to these more fundamental questions.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you mentioned early, like the asking big questions. Um, this could be my own, bias or insecurities or whatever it may be. But I think initially, sometimes I have thought that asking some of these big questions, especially in certain, places, wherever it may be, like around Christianity, religion, just
Mm.
big questions in general, can feel uncomfortable
Yep.
for some. I didn't necessarily think like early on of people like Augustine and Aquinas that come up in your book of people that really wrestled with
Yep.
the big questions. Sometimes it can feel like I should just have faith, maybe, or it's like I don't necessarily. Why do I need to know, or why do I need to wrestle with this particular question?
I'm glad you pointed that out, because part of my own story, Joshua, when I was 16, back in that sort of identifiable moment for me when this quest started, is I had already become a Christian. I had already said I was going to be an apprentice or follower of Jesus Christ, but then I realized I'd like to understand at a more deep level the commitments of Christianity, right? I'd like to understand the philosophical and theological commitments. And I remember turning to those in my immediate religious community, my church community, and just asking for insight and guidance about how to navigate some of these tough philosophical objections, even to Christianity, like the problem of evil, pervasive and horrendous evil. Is this the kind of world we would expect to see if Christianity were true? No, it's not. And so, how do I think through these questions with substance and honesty, right? How do I wrestle? And I remember, Joshua, the response that I got was well meaning, but it was something along the lines you just gave, that, hey, you really shouldn't be pressing into these kinds of questions. You really need to just have more faith, whatever that was, and how they were understanding that. Something along the lines of, you just need to dial up your psychological certainty in these things rather
Yeah.
than actually explore with intellectual substance. This is not a new question. Let's actually dive into how these questions were answered historically. There's a rich well of wisdom in the Christian tradition that I just was blind to and oblivious to. And so I think for me, it was realizing philosophy was that way of leaning in intellectually. It was a way of sort of moving from intellectual neutral, sort of idling in intellectual neutral in my faith, to actually seeking to understand what it is that I believe and testing its coherence, seeing if it's on reliable foundation. Does this view of the world make sense? Um,
Mm,
that sort of thing. So I completely understand, and I think that might just be a function of many modern Christian communities than actually historic Christian teaching about the relationship between
mm,
Christianity and philosophy. As I point out in the book, Christianity was a way of life for many of these ancient thinkers. It provided a truth aimed, action guiding view of the world for the sake of living well, and it had intellectual substance to it that guided one's life, and uh, it, it was very much a rival way of viewing the world and in living one's life. And so I guess for me, the more I dug into that rich well of wisdom in the Christian tradition, the more I became confident that I didn't have to shy away from intellectually exploring my faith.
mm. Beautiful. Let me ask you, as someone who doesn't have any sort of formal like theology training and things like that, I have always heard that um, monks and things like that generally start with philosophy before getting to some of the theology work. Is that true? Is that like a traditional thing of starting with philosophy before getting into theological training?
In terms of like formal
Yes.
training,
Yeah.
yeah, well, theology was considered, at least in the medieval schools, as the queen of the sciences. So there were certain prerequisites that you had to engage in by way of study before you were allowed to sort of engage in theological reflection.
Mm,
So logic, dialectic, philosophy. These were very much part and parcel of curriculum, university curriculum, um, before theology was on the docket, so to speak. And there are various interesting reasons for that. But yeah, depending on uh, who you focus on, that's right in some cases. Yeah.
yeah. Interesting. We generally start these conversations with maybe defining terms and things like that. And one that comes up early in the book is wonder.
Yeah.
So could you talk about, just the general, how are you thinking about wonder in daily life?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. I think what initially got me wondering about this question about the nature of wonder was, the more you read around, as I'm familiar with your podcast now, and some of the people you've had on, philosophy is a way of life. This sort of idea that philosophy begins in wonder, sort of an ancient philosophical way of life, was suffused with this posture of wonder. You find it in Plato's Theaetetus, you find it in Aristotle, you find it later in the Christian tradition. Wonder is kind of an essential ingredient to the philosophical life for many of these ancient thinkers. And it got me thinking, well, what is it to wonder? I mean, I know it when I see it, but how do I get a grasp on what is it? What sets the experience of wonder apart from other human experiences, right? And I began to read around, and I realized, in the last 15 years or so, Joshua, the literature in the psychological sciences about awe and wonder has just exploded. It's been really neat. And I would just
Yeah.
encourage listeners, if you'd like to dive in further on this, it is incredibly enriching. And you think wonder is a big part of the beginning, the middle, and the end of the philosophical life. It's fascinating. So what I do is I borrow an account. It's a fairly well-known account in the psychological literature from Dr. Keltner and Jonathan Haidt. They say there are two basic ingredients to an experience of wonder. And the first is perceived vastness, and the second is a need for accommodation. So the first, perceived vastness, is one encounters something that's much larger than oneself, right? Something that's beyond one's ordinary range of experience or frame of reference, right? So we often express this as it was mind blowing, right? This could either be a physical like object, like the Grand Canyon. Uh, it could be another human being in terms of their like moral weight or gravitas, right? That just has an incredible impact on you. It could be an idea or a theoretical concept, like the special theory of relativity or Gödel's theorem, those examples I give in the book, right? Something that's just theoretically complex, that's just mind blowing. It sort of shakes you out of the humdrum of ordinary experience. So perceive vastness. Remember, that doesn't just mean physical vastness, but just it could be theoretical vastness, ideological vastness, or physical vastness. But the second is a need for accommodation. So once you perceive the vastness of the object, you realize you've got to make some adjustments or accommodations in the way that you think about or conceive of the world, right? Maybe
Mm.
your view of the world was too small or too narrow or too one-sided. So it's the realization that your grasp on the world is too small. It's just not adequate to the way things truly are, right? Whether about the natural world, whether about mathematics, or the structure of the physical universe, or even God. It could be theological as well. So it's these two conditions that Keltner and Haidt say define an experience of wonder, in particular, psychologically.
I'm curious to ask Ross, in the way of wonder, and we're talking about this like way of life. Is this
Yeah.
something we should intentionally seek out, like intentionally attempt to experience, or does that take some of the awe and wonder out of it?
Yeah. Well, I think for many of us, we don't have to be taught to seek experiences of wonder. And I just think, and the example I give in the book is this would be an extreme kind of limit example, but the idea of space tourism, right? When people tell us when they come back from the edge of space, just the seeing Earth from the vantage point of space, just it hits them so hard and has such an impact on them that it actually puts their whole life into perspective.
Mm.
It makes them feel very small and insignificant, but in a good way, right? It sort of
Yeah.
reorders their priorities. It makes them more connected to the earth and other human beings on it. So I think we all can't seek wonder in that sense, but I think even in a more mundane level, I think we crave experiences like this, these jaw-dropping, mind-blowing experiences somewhere on the spectrum of wonder, whether that's in nature, right, encountering the vast magnitude of the Pacific Ocean or the Grand Canyon, or learning something new that just boggles the mind, or I didn't know that, right? There's this kind of aha experience that I think at a deep level many of us crave, and I actually don't think these kinds of if we were made, as I argue in the book, we were made for these kinds of experiences. I don't think they can actually be diminished by repetition.
Mm.
So, in the sense of like, if they're truly awe-inspiring and wonderful, right? That actually is like a deeply soul-satisfying experience, because we were made just as like eating. It can be a deeply satisfied experience. My repeated eating, it doesn't just, I mean, I'm satisfied whenever I eat, right?
Yeah.
Physically, I love eating. But, it doesn't diminish the pleasure of eating for me because I do it 3 times a day. I tend to think, this is just, my own reporting, my own experience here too, is these experiences of wonder tend not to be diminished by repetition in the same way that, the pleasure I get from satisfying a physical hunger doesn't diminish by eating 3 times a day. It's a deeply pleasurable experience because I was made to take in food. And I argue that if you connect up our deep wonder hunger to a larger philosophical, theological story like Christianity, that we were actually made for God, and that He is the object that is truly vast and immense. And if we were made for Him on the Christian story, well, then it's no surprise that we exhibit this kind of wonder hunger at a basic, ordinary, mundane level. Um, yeah, so that's a good question. I tend to think that it doesn't diminish kind of the force of these experiences by their being had more frequently, just because of the way that we're made.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a fascinating thing. You mentioned the space travel piece, which is may not be something readily available, but something I did 5 years ago or so now. Um, Went to the planetarium in Baltimore, which is
Yeah.
just awesome, and it might be up there as like one of the most profound things I've done. I mean, just an absolute amazing thing to be able to like get some insights in that
Mm.
like forum. These planetariums are really well done, especially that one, of just the vastness.
Yep.
It's unbelievable.
Yep.
And that's something that they have quite a few of those, even in small town type of places like I where I am. Those things exist.
Mm.
But even if not, that like looking up at the night sky, if we can
Mm.
remember to do it and take it
Mm.
in, it's unbelievable.
Yep.
The mystery and the vastness is all around us, but it's so easy to miss.
Yep. Yep. You're putting your finger on what Docker and Keltner call the small self effect, right? They say
Mm,
experiences of wonder actually do something to those who regularly wonder or who are regularly in awe. They experience this small self effect. So we tend to, they call it a self transcendent emotion as well. So it like pulls us out of ourselves and actually makes us see our proper place in the world, right? It's easy to see our own lives and our own needs as kind of the center of gravity of the world. And when you encounter something like that you're describing, it has this small self effect where you actually see yourself um, and your life in its proper perspective, and that can be an incredibly healthy thing. It can also make you more connected to others, and I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. It can have there's social benefits in addition to individual psychological benefits about regularly experiencing wonder. And it's funny, if wonder is connected to the philosophical life, as it was classically, you might even say a lot of these individual and social psychological benefits can actually follow on the heels of philosophy. So, like,
yeah,
what is valuable? Why is philosophy and philosophical activity? Why is it individually and socially valuable? um, I think I think it can actually draw upon the value of these regular experiences of wonder, uh, and sort of appeal to the individual and social benefits of being in states of wonder and awe, but also just living philosophically as well.
yeah. I love how you said wonder, hunger. It's like it's within us. We're born for it. It reminds me of a previous episode a while back that some of the
Yeah.
listeners might remember. Author of Nasty Brutus and Short, Scott Harowitz, wrote a book. Also, a philosopher wrote a book with his kids, and he's making the case as kids
Sweet.
natural philosophers. And I have a 5 year old. And when you think of wonder, I mean, sometimes he'll, I mean, just look around at any toddlers. A lot of times that, kind of get down and will really take in and like really be excited about a bird, an insect, all sorts of things. And like we have that within us. It seems like we can maybe we get a little numb to it as we,
Yeah.
navigate life and
Yep.
get other responsibilities and things like that. But it is an interesting idea that it's, born within us. It's like our natural kind of state to be curious and, and wonder. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yep. Yep. I think
uh,
there's
Good.
um a really cool sort of harmony, as I say in the book, that in terms of though this wonder philosophy connection doesn't originate with Judeo-Christianity, but it does find a natural home in Judeo-Christianity. And there are those three conditions I mentioned. Is one, we actually we have a hunger for these type of experiences, right? We don't need to be taught to try to we are meaning seeking animals, right?
Yeah.
That's an interesting tenet, right? We could have not been meaning seeking animals. Not every creature or even animal is a meaning seeking animal. Two, that nature in the world is actually truly wonderful. Like there are wonders out there that are waiting uh, to be beheld and to be seen and to be enjoyed and to be taken in, right? Uh, Nature could have been just very drab, and it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be elegant and beautiful, even at the mathematical level. It doesn't have to at all. And then secondly, like we were we were built with this unique capacity to actually track that wonderful creation, right? So, one, we've got this hunger. Two, nature is truly wonderful. And we're endowed with the kind of cognitive equipment to be able to actually track it and to enjoy it and to behold it. Um, that's very hard to make sense of on certain philosophical ways of life, or at least visions of reality, where everything is just atoms banging around in a void,
Mm.
with no sort of purpose or goal directedness. It does seem like a cosmic accident that we can discern the wonder that's there to discern and be reliably good at it and actually develop complex theoretical physical theories about the world. It's very surprising, but I guess that's why I say in the book, uh, the Christian story provides a really neat unifying backdrop to the wonder-filled philosophical life that perhaps other stories can't.
Mm. Yeah. Another term or phrase is obviously in the title of the book, philosophy as a way of life.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about, the history of this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a little while. You remind me if I'm missing this, but I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the chapter on philosophy as a way of life, that philosophy has a bit of a public relations problem.
Yeah.
Um, I think when a lot of people think of, although not your listeners, for sure, I think they're fairly attuned to this concept, but many people just have a very strange view of what philosophy is, that it seems so out of touch with, my 9 to 5, um, how I parent, how I navigate the workplace, what I eat, right? How I take care of my body or whether I take care of my body. These sorts of things. I mean, what does philosophy have to do with my life? And you know, uh, as you're well aware of, ancient philosophy was not really wrestling with this type of public relations problem in the way that we wrestle today. Philosophy was viewed as an entire life orientation, an entire way of being in the world. All right. It wasn't just, as some people think of it today, as a sort of a class you take and you sort of check it off the curriculum list and you say goodbye to philosophy forever, right? I think that's how a lot of people view philosophy. It's kind of like a one-time thing you do to get a grade so you can get a degree, and then you sort of never do philosophy or live philosophically ever again. I think it's way more subtle than that. It's more of a way of life than a moment, right? And I give the example in the book about um, playing music versus being a musician, right? Those are very different concepts, right? And what sets those two apart would be something like a musician has their entire life structured by various values and priorities and practices that are these are ordinary rhythms of their life, right? So the playing, the teaching, the writing of music is kind of part of the warp and woof of their life, right? My picking up a guitar, every 3 months and kind of strumming around on it doesn't make me a musician, right? So there's something about like the is the activity woven into the fabric of your life as a whole? And I think for many of these ancient philosophers, so for many of these ancient philosophical schools in Athens, right, like Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, Epicurus's Garden, Zeno's Porch, um, these philosophical schools had a view, a more encompassing view of the philosophical life than just that, right? And so, one major part of philosophy as a way of life, at least in antiquity, which you're no doubt familiar with and your listeners are familiar with, was that the idea that philosophy was a kind of therapy of the soul. As Martha Nussbaum puts it, this idea was so pervasive right in antiquity. It was this, she calls it a medical model of philosophizing, right? That philosophizing could actually help bring about greater clarity and health and integrity of soul for the sake of living well. And I just don't think that's how many people view philosophy today, whether that's in like an academic context or even on the street. People are often left with a vision of philosophy as completely irrelevant and out of touch with one's life, right? And I think of some years back, Marco Rubio, the Florida senator, gave some remarks at I think it was some rally or something. He said, we need less philosophers, more welders and less philosophers, right? Because he says, welders make more money than philosophers, and that right there is evidence of philosophers are these relics of a bygone age for many people. They're out of touch with reality, and what are they good for, right? And I think that might be part and parcel, Joshua, of a completely restrictive view of what the philosophical life is supposed to be. And I think retrieving an ancient philosophical way of life that's therapeutic, that can bring about greater health of soul for the sake of living well, now I think you're connecting more to the relevance question, right? What does philosophy have to do with my life? A great deal, actually.
Yeah. And you write about it beautifully in the book, and I was so happy to also see, that this is not some 400 or 500 page book, just for the for the listeners in case they're expecting something like that. It's very very readable and concise. I'm curious to touch on something you said, and I made a note of it. You write in the book, philosophy's chief aim is to help one structure one's life to properly see and orient oneself to the world. Could you say a bit more about that orient? What does it mean to orient oneself to the world?
Yeah, really good. I'm glad you asked that question. And maybe to illustrate, I think I use this example in the book, but take the good of bodily health, right? I might see that bodily health is a good worth pursuing, right? Suppose I lay hold of that truth. I say, yes, it's good to be biologically healthy. Now, that's me seeing that that is a good and end worth pursuing, right? Now, here we are in January, right? I imagine many of us have made New Year's resolutions where we've clearly seen that that's a good worth pursuing. We may even have committed, ourselves to uh, living differently in light of seeing that that's a real good worth pursuing, right? We may have purchased gym memberships, right? Um, or bought new running shoes or a new Apple Watch. I don't know. Um, but the orienting your life accordingly would, at some level, you would need to begin incorporating new rhythms and practices into your life that are structured around the good of bodily health, right? And so this is my way of trying to pick up that, uh, at least on my read. And here I'm siding with Pierre Hadot over and against some other ancient historians of philosophy like John Cooper. Philosophy doesn't stay at the sort of cerebral cognitive level. It's not just a matter of seeing what goods are ultimately worth pursuing, um, but it's actually it's cultivating a certain habit or disposition to pursue those goods and to not pursue other goods, right? To remove barriers in one's life that keep you from pursuing the goods that you see to be the case. So this would involve actually engaging in various exercises or practices. And in the case of bodily health, that would be actually like getting to the place where you're actually physically exercising, or you're actually watching your diet. You're maybe doing so in the company of like good friends for the sake of accountability or something like that, right? You're actually engaged in practices that are going to kind of keep you on the rails, towards the end of this good called bodily health, right? So it's gonna involve what you do, from 9 to 5. And I think this is a degreed concept. One could more or less orient one's life around the good of bodily health, to use our example, right? Someone could just say, you know what, I'm going to start exercising. And they start going to the gym for the first time, right? They're actually taking steps, they're orienting their life around the good of bodily health. They're actually engaged in practices that are going to help them achieve that end of bodily health, right? So they're in a better position than the person who says, yes, I want to be healthy. That's a good thing. And they never actually engage the will and engage in practices that are going to get them there, right? Yet that person, that beginner, is in a very different place, we might say, than the fitness guru who's in the gym 3 hours, 4 hours a day, who everything they do is structured around that aim or purpose or some similar purpose. So that strikes me as a degreed concept. One can more or less orient their life around a particular good. And living philosophically, as I put it in the book, is to some degree or other, right? Because I want to say there can be like philosophical novices, but also philosophical veterans. We all don't have to be Socrates to live a philosophical way of life, right? I can still chocolate cake and occasionally succumb to that temptation, and yet still be on balance committed to and orient my life towards the good of bodily health, for example. So that twofold definition is, it's living philosophically, at least for many of these ancients on my read, is about more than just seeing reality in the grain of reality clearly, but it's actually like walking along and living with the grain of reality, where your life is actually lockstep with the grain of reality, not just seeing, oh, I believe that's the way I ought to live, but one is actually taking steps, ordering their life around those particular goals worth achieving.
Mm. Let me ask you, Ross, is it fair to say that we all have a philosophy of life? Like, the question is whether our, perspectives, principles, and practices, line up with where we're, the type of life we want to lead. Is that fair to say, or is that too simplistic? What would you add to that?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I do want to allow for many of our kind of weightiest philosophical beliefs to be sometimes tacit, so they sort of are humming underneath the surface. I might not even be
Mm,
fully aware that that's what I believe. I think there can be the like hidden beliefs or deep beliefs that
mm,
often are beyond uh my ability to be aware of them. I think desires are like that. Often deep desires that I'm not aware of drive my life. I think beliefs can be like that as well. So whether or not everybody has like a a clear grasp or awareness of some of these deep, weighty philosophical beliefs that drive what they do from 9 to 5. That's maybe one thing. I definitely don't think everyone's
Yeah.
aware of, right? Aware of them. But I mean, we all are going to be motivated in terms of ordinary daily actions, right? By belief desire sets, right? I believe that it's going to rain today. I desire to stay dry, so I grab my umbrella, right?
Yeah.
That's a belief desire set that influences my grabbing my umbrella versus not, right? I think there are all sorts of beliefs and desires that humans have that guide their action, that lie beyond their direct awareness, but that are nonetheless there. So, in one sense, I think you could say everyone has some set of deep beliefs about the world that do inevitably guide, right, what they do from 9 to 5, um, or at least tend to drive or influence what they do from 9 to 5. Um, and that's why I think there's great clarity in just when someone says I believe X, well, just watch what they do, right? Watch the way they live. And I think that will be proven true whether they believe X, if you find them doing things that are consistent with X. There's a difference between, I want to say, believing something, Joshua, and professing to believe something. I think your
Yeah.
beliefs will inevitably drive your actions, maybe not your professed beliefs, right? But your real beliefs will actually drive what you do. So I think everyone has those, and I think they do inevitably drive action. Whether they're the beliefs one thinks one has, that's another question
Yeah.
altogether. So I think the philosophical life is just sort of bringing your beliefs to the surface to evaluate, to test, to see if they ring true with reality, to see if things are the way that you think you believe they are, and what might lead me to think otherwise. So yeah, that's the examined life. At least my take on it. It's sometimes it's the hard work of trying to figure out what do I truly believe about the world, um, and how can I bring that into the light of day to scrutinize and to examine to see if it's actually true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. It reminds me of something in addition to that's come up on previous episode of, you're talking about the awareness of it, but I've had one guest suggest in that when it comes to a philosophy of life, we adopt one of these existing philosophies of life that have, kind of been around for thousands of years, like Christianity in this case, making the claim that sometimes the philosophy of life that we come up with or that we mash together in some sort of way isn't always coherent in the way of that, like orienting ourselves. Maybe it doesn't orient ourselves in a coherent way like some of these ancient, timeless traditions that are kind of still around today. Yeah, so it's interesting, but we're kind of running down on time here, and I've got as a final topic maybe a bit of a challenging topic and question, but I think you're up for it. You obviously have it in the book, which is around contemplation.
Yeah.
And I made a note here of something you write in the book. The task of cultivating deep attention to morally and spiritually weighty matters has traditionally been called contemplation. So could you say a bit more about contemplation, just in general, whatever comes to mind, Ross?
Yeah. Sure. Sure. Yeah. I guess one pass at this, again, contemplation would be one of these many faceted jewels that you could say a lot about.
Yeah.
Different forms of contemplation, different standpoints of contemplation. Aristotle has this conception of theoria, right, which is a very Aquinas picks up and sort of does some interesting theological things with. Um, but contemplation, I guess, broadly considered, would just be the consideration of truth. And the way that I unpack contemplation, in one of the chapters is, if we are meaning seeking animals, right? We have this, as Aristotle said, we desire to know, to understand. That is sort of like part of what it means to be human. Then to consider truth, for the mind to feed upon truth, is actually deeply fulfilling to the human being, right? It can be a part of a flourishing human life to consider or contemplate the nature and structure of reality. What is true? What truly is, right? So at the very broadest level, it'd just be the consideration of the truth. Now, that could be done from one standpoint or another, right? One could devote oneself to the consideration of truth from the standpoint of, um, you might say, unaided human reason. That is apart from divine revelation, or apart from the Holy Scriptures, or apart from some sort of special revelation from God, right? This would be more in the lines of philosophical contemplation, right? It would be the consideration of the truth by simply attending to the ordinary structure of human experience, uh, moral goods, virtue, the life that's ultimately worth pursuing, and the life that's ultimately not worth pursuing, and the various means of getting there, right? This would be the consideration of beauty. That would be a part of philosophical contemplation. So it's just seeking to understand the truth, how it all fits together and hangs together as a whole, would be an aspect of philosophical contemplation. Requires deep attention. Actually, I think it requires certain moral preconditions too, Joshua. I don't think you can just sort of snap your fingers and be good at paying deep attention to the world. There are many, many, as I talk about in the book, there are many hurdles and roadblocks to considering and pondering and contemplating truth that are there for us today to consider and to navigate around. Um, so at that level, but one could also consider the truth from the standpoint of like theology. This would be called theological contemplation. So pondering the deep meaning and significance of all things and how they hang together, in particular, as they are in Christ, right? In the Christian tradition, Christ is sort of he is the Logos, right? So it turns out this ancient rational ordering principle of the universe that we find in ancient philosophy has a human face in the Christian tradition, and it's Jesus of Nazareth, right? And so theological contemplation would be this added dimension of you're pondering and considering the truth as a whole, how all things hang together, their deep meaning and purpose as they hang together, but it's ultimately as they hang together in Christ. And so theological contemplation has that additional, more specific dimension to it, where it's not just done by way of unaided human reason, but it's sort of brought more into focus, and it's brought into focus centered on the person of Jesus Christ. So you find both of these in amongst Christian philosophers in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, this idea of philosophical contemplation and theological contemplation, kind of like incomplete happiness that can be attained by way of even just philosophical contemplation. So wholly apart from special revelation, one can feed that one's mind can feed upon the truth, and that's a deeply fulfilling and satisfying human experience because you were made for the truth. You were made to understand, as Aristotle said. But for Aquinas, there's a more satisfying kind of contemplation. As a Christian, Thomas Aquinas would say, and it's considering the truth and how all things hang together in their deepest meaning as they hang together in Christ. Um, it's more satisfying because the object of contemplation, namely Christ Himself, um, is more radiant. It's more has greater moral worth and moral weight. These kinds of things. So I think just broadest conception would be the consideration of truth. You can do that either from the standpoint of human reason, unaided by divine revelation or divine grace, or you could do that from the standpoint of divine revelation.
Mhm.
Those would be at least two two things to say, very very cursory things to say about that.
I appreciate that very much. And I want to talk about, towards the end of the conversation, kind of, the practical thing in daily life. But I don't want to diminish, this idea of contemplation
Yeah.
in any way. So that's not where I'm obviously trying to go with it. But I'm curious, like you brought up Aquinas, for
Yeah.
example, and as the story goes, this big, huge summa and all sorts of writing, that's probably taller than I am. Um, at some point, he had an experience of God, and essentially talked about all of his writing that is very respected today as nothing but a bed of straw or something like that. Please correct me if that's not the case. Um, I'm curious, like, if you could say something about like contemplation, this like leading to some sort of experience. Like it's not thinking like we traditionally might,
Mm.
connect it to. I don't know, like anything you could say in the way of
Mm.
experience, and maybe if there's some way to tie it back to wonder, how it connects or doesn't connect, in maybe leading us to wonder and awe.
Yeah, good. I mean, I would just say that contemplation is a kind of vision. Um, this is how the scriptures describe um, contemplation. It is a kind of vision, not with one's physical eyes, but with the mind. I mean, this is very, Plato talks about this as well. Um, that there's a kind of seeing that can happen, an experiential scene that's not necessarily moving from one premise to another by way of like discursive reasoning, but it's a kind of an intuitive, like you take it all in with a kind of vision, almost as if you were looking at the Grand Canyon and in sort of one perceptual experience and you're taking it in and it's just staggering what you're seeing, right? That is the kind of vision. That's the way that many of these Christian philosophers and theologians talk about contemplation. It is a kind of intellectual experience that is intrinsically tied to action, for sure. But they have a lot to say about the relationship between the active and the contemplative life. So it's not just contemplation as this intellectual vision or experience of what's true and good and beautiful, but it is a kind of intellectual scene or experience. And what I think was going on perhaps with Aquinas is, so he even says that uh, all forms of light, he calls them imperfect contemplation, right? We can see in some sense, although as the scriptures say, we see in a glass dimly, right? Paul says,
Mm.
that is a way of saying we can see what's truly morally good and spiritually weighty now in this life, but our vision isn't 2020, you might say, now. But there will come a time, and well, let me just say, in contemplation is the way that we sort of see what's truly worth pursuing in life and actually going after it. But there will come a time on the Christian story when we will no longer see, right, in a glass dimly. Our vision, our existential vision, you might say, will be 2020. And that is a kind of perfect contemplation. So for Aquinas, contemplation is a degreed notion. You can engage in contemplative practice now. You can consider truth as it relates to your life and how you structure your life now, but it's not 2020 type of vision, um, but it serves as a kind of foretaste of the vision to come, and that's just traditionally what Christians have called the beatific vision. It's when we will
Mm.
see God as he is, the most morally weighty and valuable being in all of the universe. We'll actually behold him. We will have that experience that I think Aquinas had a foretaste of before he died and moved on to the next life. Um, so I don't want to say that he thought everything he did was worthless. I think
Yeah.
what he was saying was, in comparison to
Yeah.
to my beholding what I was just seeing without 2020 vision before, this eclipses the value of everything that I've done. I think that speaks more to the value of what he saw than the disvalue of what he did in his life.
Yeah. Well, beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Ross.
Yeah,
I think
of
that's
course.
really helpful and definitely a difficult topic to talk about. And I highly recommend everybody pick up the book. I think the listeners will really enjoy it. We've made it to this final wrap up question, and sometimes I feel bad about asking a question. How do you define or think about wisdom? Because maybe we've been talking about that for the last hour or so.
Yeah,
But what comes to mind briefly around, how should we think about wisdom in daily life?
yeah, excellent. I think I mentioned a definition in the book that I think is from an older theologian, now dead. His name was J.I. Packer,
Mm,
and he wrote a little book called Knowing God. And I would just add a little bit to Packer's definition, but I'll read it, and it goes like this: um, cultivating. Now, this would be from a Christian philosophical perspective, right? As I'm coming at things in the book, cultivating by God's empowering grace the power to see and the inclination to choose the best and the highest goals and the surest means of attaining them.
mm,
So it's the power to cultivate by God's grace the ability to see and the inclination to choose the best and the highest goals and the surest means of attaining them. So that definition of just like wisdom for daily life involves the intellect, the ability to see. If this isn't directed in the right direction, there are going to be problems for your life as a whole. It involves the will, the inclination to choose, right? Cultivating a greater inclination to choose the best and the highest goals. It seems that there are the best and the highest goals to aim at, but not just that, but the surest means of attaining those goals. So that's where practical wisdom would be employed as well. It's not just that I see where I need to be and I become more reliable in heading in that direction. If I have no practical wisdom about how to get there, right? I won't get there. Um, it's like one, you can use a sailing analogy, right? One could say, yeah, I know where I need to be. There's the destination, right, on the map. I want to sail to Catalina Island. Um, One could even set off, right, on a sea voyage to Catalina Island, right? But if you have no idea how to sail, if you don't know how to like raise the sail or I don't know, whatever sailors do. I'm not a sailor. But you know what I mean? Like if you
yeah.
don't know how to steer a boat or if you don't know how to like read the winds, you're in trouble. So I think wisdom for living, it can't just be reduced to any one of those. I think it actually has to be like a dynamic and harmony between those, the power to see, the inclination to choose the best and the highest goals, and the surest means of attaining those
Mm,
goals. So I think it's kind of a dance between those three things that, at least for the Christian, without God's empowering aid, we won't be able to properly see. We won't be able to cultivate the disposition to choose the best and the highest goods, let alone the surest means of attaining them. So this
mm,
is a kind of human and divine interaction that takes place for the Christian to live a life of wisdom in the fullest sense.
mm. Love it. Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. Again, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking the time. For the listeners, the book is Christian Philosophy as a Way of Life. I highly recommend it. Are there any, websites or places that you might point our listeners before we wrap up?
Just in terms of in general or my own work, or what were you
Yeah,
thinking?
I was thinking your own work.
Yeah. Yeah, rostyinman.com is a place to connect with some of my previous work. You can check out the things that I've written there, other books and other articles. That would be a good place to start.
All right, great. Well, we'll link that in the show notes so it's easy to find. All right, Ross Inman, thank you so much for coming on In Search of Wisdom.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you so much.